Hello Groove 3 viewers, this is Matt, and today we'll be starting a series called Editing Drums in Logic Pro 10. We're using version 10.2, and the first thing I want to do is do an overview of what all we'll be covering during this series. First thing you'll see is that I've brought in some drum tracks that we did at the studio, and we'll be covering how to use flex time. We will also be covering the quite legendary, quite useful, yet older function called beat mapping. Finally, we'll be covering tom editing, as some call it hyper editing, as well as drum replacement. We're also going to cover all the nuances of using flex time within Logic Pro 10. For example, which mode to use, which track should be chosen as a cue track or an anchor track, transient detector sensitivity, and much, much more. This series' strongest focus will be dealing with editing multi-track drums using flex time. So welcome to the series, and in the next video, we'll get started by properly grouping the drums. We'll explain why we group the drums, and we'll choose an anchor track or a cue track, as well as go over a phase-locked group, and why we choose to have a phase-locked group when editing multi-track drums. I'm ready to get started, and I hope you are, and I'll see you in the next video. First thing I want to look at is grouping the drums properly. Here you can see that we have 10 drum tracks, and the drummer played with a click. I'll hit play. Okay, and now what we're going to do, he played pretty darn tight with the click, but I want to tighten it up even more so that later we could say add loops or MIDI instrumentation to the grid and it'll perfectly line up. Oh, and by the way, at this point, these are just raw tones to tape. And by that I mean we haven't EQ'd anything yet, because that's not the focus of this video. So first things first, let's go to the mixer view. Now let's highlight all of our drums. Next, go to the Group tab. Click on it, and then select Group 1. Now as you can see, the number 1 has popped up by each drum track. Let's click on that again and open Group Settings. Now let's name the group. Alright, our group is named Drums. Under the Settings arrow, let's click Editing. We want to make sure that Phase Locked Audio is selected. The reason for this is because anytime you record multiple audio tracks at the same time with live microphones, you want to make sure that while we're editing, that everything stays phase coherent. Okay, that's done, so we can close this little window. So what do we need to do next? Let's go back to our main window, and you'll notice that there's a cue beside each one of these tracks. Now, the way we're going to be editing drums, I certainly don't want a cue beside each and every track. The cue is basically an anchor track. This is what flex time is going to look at as indicators for, say, your 1 and your 3 or your in-between beat, depending on what you choose. So usually you want a cue track or an anchor track to be your downbeat and an upbeat. So first thing I'm going to do is I definitely want kick in, which is my first kick drum, to be an anchor track. Next, snare top. I also want that to be an anchor track. We could use a hi-hat track as an anchor track, but I'm not going to. Reason being is I don't want to edit that tightly for this. I want the drums to maintain a pretty natural feel. Sky tom and squatty leg tom, or small tom big tom, I want both of those to be anchor tracks because they're tracks with very strong transients. Overhead left and right, no. And room, no. So basically your anchor tracks need to be tracks with strong transients. Okay, now that we've selected our cue tracks, the next thing I want to do is edit the tom tracks. As you can see, on the Sky Tom track, there are extra transients from snare bleed. So let's solo that track. All I want coming through that track is tom. So let's find where there's an actual tom hit. So the next thing we need to do is go ahead and ungroup the drums. You can use a quick key, or you can go up to Mix and disable groups. So we're still soloed. Let's zoom in. And this is where our first tom hit was. I'll simply make a cut here. Get rid of anything in front of it. I'm going to zoom in a little further, make sure we're catching the front of the transient. Do a really small fade. Cut at the end, and do another fade. And then continue that for the rest of the track. Now once toms have been edited, they'll look a lot like this. As you can see, I've cut between all of the transients. The next thing I want to do is you want to make sure that those toms, since they are a Q reference track, you want to make sure they're one region. But I'm going to do all of this at once. Reason being is I also want every region to have the same start position for when we go into flex mode. That is required. So while we're grouped, let's take the marquee tool and highlight all the way to the front, starting position 1. Next, go up to File, Bounce, and Replace All Tracks. It'll give you a dialog box recommending that you save. So let's do that. We want normalize turned off, and that's it. So just hit OK, and then it will go through the process. This is very similar to consolidating in Pro Tools. Okay, now each track is one region and they all have the same starting position. So we can move on. The next thing I want to do is take a look at the sensitivity on the transient detector. Let's get into that. Starting with our first track, kick in 1. Let's go up to that region and double click. This will pull up the track editor, but let's go to the file editor. Okay, now what we're looking at is the actual audio file that is related to our kick in track. First thing I want to do is go to View and then click on Transient Editing Mode. What this will do is it will place transient markers wherever it detects a transient, but we only want it to detect the kick drum. So I can tell that obviously some of these are not kick drums. It also gives us a plus and minus button, and these buttons control the sensitivity of that detector. So we want to hit minus a few times. As we're hitting minus, you'll see some of those transient markers go away. This one is a snare, so I don't want a transient marker on the snare because we're looking at the kick track only right now. So keep hitting minus until it goes away. Now let's zoom out and let's take a look. It looks like it's catching another snare here. And it was, so let's hit minus a few more times. Double check. I'm going to zoom out even more. And that all looks pretty good. There's another snare right here. You can also double click on the transient marker to remove it. Likewise, using the pencil tool, you can add a transient marker. And there we go. Okay, we should be good to go on this kick track, so let's move on to the snare track and do the same thing. Once again, double click, and we're already at the file editor. Click on View, Transient Editing Mode. It'll analyze it, and there you have it. And once again, those are not all snares, so let's look at the larger transients and start hitting the minus button. And that looks pretty good with the exception of this one, so I'll double click on it. Actually, that was a snare, so let's put it back. And now we have set the transient sensitivity for the snare track. Finally, we're going to do this to our tom tracks as well. Remember, any track that we chose as a Q reference needs to go through this process. The toms will be much easier because we've already done some editing. So once again, double click on the Sky Tom track and follow the same procedure. And same with our squatty leg track. Okay, that covers all the preparations we need to do before getting into flex editing. In the next video, we will get into flex editing. We'll talk about flex view. We'll talk about different modes. We'll talk about which mode to use when editing multi-track drums, and things will only get more fun and interesting from here out. So thank you again. We'll see you next time. Today, we're going to get even more involved. We're going to look at things like flex time. We're going to look at the different modes in flex time. And as a reminder, in our last video, we properly grouped the drums. We chose phase-locked editing, we chose our cue reference tracks, and we adjusted the sensitivity on the transient detector. So first thing I want to do is take a look at flex view. Now the drums are still grouped. Let's go up to show and hide flex view, which is this little icon right here. Let's press it, and you'll see several options come up on each track. If you click on the sub-menu, you'll see options for automatic, monophonic, slicing, rhythmic, polyphonic, speed effects, and tempophone. Each one of these has its purpose. For example, monophonic would be great for a bass guitar part. Rhythmic would be great for an acoustic guitar part. However, for multi-track drums, I want to select slicing mode. Let's click that and then it'll start analyzing each track. Alright, now that we're in flex view and the files have been analyzed, the next thing we should do is go to the inspector window. You can do that by pressing the I right here. Now that we're looking at the inspector window, first let's click on the little track arrow. Our focus track is kick in, and it's a cue reference track, so cue reference is checked, fill gaps is checked, and of course slicing mode. The next track, kick out, cue reference is not checked. That's because we didn't choose that as a cue reference track. However, slicing mode is turned on and fill gaps is turned on. What slicing mode does is very similar to Beat Detective in Pro Tools. It literally cuts between the transients and crossfades for you. So next let's go up to the small region arrow. We want to make sure flex is turned on, and it is, and if it were not turned on, the screen would look like this. However, flex is turned on, and now we can get to quantizing. First let's play the track unquantized. Okay, so once again, he played very tightly to the click anyways. However, let's zoom in and you'll see that it's not perfect. Next, let's go back to the inspector window. Quantize is turned off, so let's click on that and choose 16th notes. Then watch the screen. And it pulled every transient in line with the grid. Remember, the transients that it sees are based on our cue reference track and how we set the sensitivity on the transient detector earlier. Let's zoom out. Your screen will look a lot like this once things have been quantized. And let's play back. And that is as perfect as I want it. The next thing you want to do is listen through the track and make sure there were no errors in the quantization process. I've already done this for time's sake, and I did find a spot where it misplaced a crash. Let's take a listen to that. And it's right here behind bar 36. Now to remove a transient marker, and since we're grouped, you simply go up to the top of the transient marker and click the X. Now that extra transient marker is removed. Let's listen again. And that is exactly what we want. Likewise, you can move transient markers by clicking and holding and dragging. But let's go back to the original position. Scrolling forward, you can also add a transient marker where it might have missed a beat. For example, right here at bar 40, you just simply click it and pull the transient in place. Now our track is perfectly lined up with the grid. Let's zoom back out. Now that we're lined up with the grid, let's turn Flex View off because that has been done. And let's close the inspector window. Okay, the purpose of everything we did. Now, if we want to add MIDI or a software instrument, we can program those parts to the grid, and the drums are already locked in, so everything's going to line up just right. Let's open up a software instrument track. I'm just going to do a synth bass part. And here we go. And as you can see, the bass part perfectly lines up with the kick drum now. Now let's add an arpeggiated synth as a further example. And here we go with that. So thank you for watching this video. We have fully quantized the drums. We've added a few MIDI tracks and everything lines up perfect. And now we can move on with our session and keep going. In the next video, we're going to get away from flex time and we're going to talk about an older Logic feature called beat mapping. It's basically doing this, but in reverse. What will happen is basically the drums will become your grid. Rather than making the drums conform to the grid, you're going to make the grid conform to the drums. So we'll get into that and we'll see you next time. We're back, and in this segment, we'll be talking about beat mapping. Beat mapping is a much older feature in Logic, but I want to discuss that today because it's still a very useful feature. Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off. In our last session, we had created 2 new MIDI regions to go along with the flex editing that we had done. The first thing I want to do is I want to turn flex editing off. So let's open up our inspector window again. And let's go to one of the drum tracks that we were using flex editing. Since the drums are still grouped, we can just simply click the checkbox that says flex. That will turn flex editing off. And if you want a visual of that, if we are in flex view, which once again is this little icon, and we check the flex box, your screen will then return to the normal view. And if I zoom in now, you'll see that the transients are not directly on the grid any longer. Beat mapping is a little bit different. It's kind of like flex time, but it's in reverse. Basically, instead of the drum tracks conforming to the grid's going to conform to the drum track. And then all the MIDI information or software instruments that you put in afterwards will follow that. Okay, with beat mapping, the first thing I want to do is go up to the top left. Let's go ahead and turn our inspector window back off. But I want to go up to the top left, and there's an icon for show or hide global tracks. Let's click that button. Right now, I'm only showing tempo information on the global tracks. What I want to do is come to this tempo area. I want to control click and then select show beat mapping. Now we have a beat map track. So I want to keep both of those open, but I want to move these 2 MIDI regions below the drums. Now we can select a focus track for our beat map track. I'm going to select kick in because it has very strong transients. We could likewise select snare, because it also has strong transients on the 2 and 4. But let's start with kick in, and let's make sure our drums are ungrouped. Okay, so let's zoom in. What we're paying attention to is bars and beats up here. If you grab that bar by clicking and holding, it'll give you a long line going straight down. While you're holding, drag that line to the front of the kick transient. And as you can see, our tempo slightly changed when I did that. That's because the grid is moving to where the drums are exactly. Let's go to the next kick and do the same thing. And as you see, our tempo shifted again. And you can just keep doing that. Your stronger transients will be your kick drum. And as you do this, your tempo will keep conforming to that. What that's doing is now the click track is moving up and down in tempo according to each one of these downbeats. So you just keep doing that through the track. All right, now let's take a listen back. And here was another kick that I can put in there. Now let's change our focus track to the snare. So just simply click on the snare track, and you'll notice that our beat map track looks a little bit different now. So same process. Your stronger transients are going to be your snare. You go through and do this again, and your tempo changes will be even more drastic. And there you go. So we're adjusting the grid of the session to the exact timing of the drummer. Let's play back. Here's something I'd like to mention that I haven't. If we go over to where it says beat mapping, we have two small arrows, and we didn't turn on protect MIDI. And there's a reason for that. By not selecting protect MIDI in this case, when we're changing the tempo of the session, the MIDI is also conforming to it. So the MIDI that we programmed before is now conformed to this new grid. So now if we program a new MIDI or software instrument track, those parts will likewise line up to the new grid or conform to these new tempo changes. There are several ways you can use beat mapping, and this isn't the only one. However, for multi-track drums, this is the way I like to do it, and this was a great way to explain it in this particular scenario. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and in the next video, we're going to go over replacing a snare drum using Logic's replacer feature. I'd like to talk about replacing drums and doubling drums today, so let's start with the kick drum. First thing I want to do is select the kick track. Next, go up to the top where it says track, click on that, and go down to replace or double drum track. Okay, we have an instrument selection box that gives us the option of kick, snare, tom, or other. This is a kick drum, so we'll stay selected on kick. You can choose replacement or doubling. I'm going to choose doubling. Next, I'm going to move this box up so you can see the MIDI region it created underneath the kick track. We have a relative threshold which adjusts the sensitivity of the trigger. So if we slide that down, it's more sensitive. And as we slide it up, it's less sensitive. That looks about right, so let's click pre-listen. As we're using pre-listen, we can scroll through this list of kick drums that it's prepared for us. Let's do that. Since this is a doubled track, I want to use a layer kick to enhance it. So go to the Layer Kicks tab, and let's listen through those as well. Let's go with that one. For the purpose of this video, we're going to keep trigger notes at auto, and we're going to keep the timing offset at 0 milliseconds. So now we just simply need to press OK. All right, now let's take a listen. Let's solo our sample as well. And that could be blended in as needed. The reason I didn't go to replace track, I chose doubling instead, because if you want to simply replace the kick, really all you have to do is mute the actual kick track, and then you'll get the replace track only. Okay, so that's really all there is to it, but let's go ahead and do the snare as well. So I'm going to choose snare top. Once again, you go up to track, replace or double drum track. We're going to select snare under the instrument tab. Mode, we're going to do doubling again. Let's take a look at the MIDI notes that have been created underneath the snare track. And the sensitivity looks good. And so let's pre-listen. Okay, I really like that one, so simply, once again, press OK. And same rules apply. Now we can blend that sound in as desired. And once again, if we simply want to replace the snare top, just mute it. However, I liked it in there. And I also liked the kick in there. So we have two software instrument tracks now enhancing our kick and snare drum. Thank you for watching the whole series on editing multi-track drums with Logic Pro 10.